Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Today we celebrate Earth Day on a more somber note after a devastating year of a global COVID-19 pandemic. The theme this year is Restore Our Earth, which focuses on, among others, emerging green technologies and innovative thinking. But will we get the game-changing commitments and technological breakthroughs that will put us en route to restoring the planet's ecosystem? We'll discuss this tonight on the show. First up, we have Meena Rahman. Meena Rahman is the president of Sahabat Alam Malaysia. Meena, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. If I may begin with news coming up from the US, where there is a virtual summit. US President Joe Biden is hosting 40 world leaders at this virtual summit to raise global commitment to tackle climate change. Now, I'm wondering, Meena, because the US, they themselves have pledged to cut carbon emissions by up to 52% below 2005 levels by the end of this decade. That sounds impressive, but is it as impressive as it sounds, Meena?
Well, actually, if you look at what the U.S. groups are saying, civil society groups in the U.S., they are saying that it doesn't go far enough when you look at it from what they call a fair share perspective. This is something that we also in Sahabat Alam Malaysia and many groups also call for. Fair share means you look at it from the perspective of the historical emissions and the cumulative emissions over the years. And what the U.S. groups actually have called for is 195% emission reductions based on 2005 levels. And what you see Biden promise is only 52% by 2005 levels. So you can see a stark, wide gap between what the U.S. progressive groups are calling for and what President Biden has announced. And so for those of us who are not familiar, this is because there is a very limited carbon space left in the world. You have only like about 12 years of carbon space left before the temperature limit of 1.5 degrees is reached.
Meena, may I interrupt you there very quickly and get you to explain a little bit? A couple of questions here. Why is this benchmarked against 2005 emission levels? Why not 2021 levels? I mean, that was 16 years ago. Why are the emission levels benchmarked there? If you could explain to the audience. And secondly, what you mean in terms of a carbon space. Is it carbon
space?
Yes, that's right. If you couldn't explain a little bit.
Yes. Well, actually, 2005 levels are rather late, actually, because the benchmark ought to have been 1990 levels. If you look at the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, for developed countries, the benchmark is supposed to be 1990. This was when the convention came into the Climate Change Convention, the international convention that governs, agreement between the North and the South of the world. But they are looking at it from 2005 levels, because 2005 levels, the emissions are high. So if you're taking a 52% reduction, you're actually not going very much. Whereas if you look at 1990 levels, then you have to take a much deeper cut. So there is actually a lot of mumbo-jumbo in the numbers. And I think the devil is really in the details, and sometimes we all get confused. On the issue of the carbon space and the carbon budget, now everybody in Paris agreed that for the temperature rise to be limited to 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, this is before the Industrial Revolution, or to pursue 1.5 degree limit. Actually, for those of us in civil society, we say that 1.5 limit is the guardrail. Now we are already at 1.2 degrees limit rise. So there is very little atmospheric space. All these emissions are emitted into the atmosphere. The atmosphere, when the Industrial Revolution began, was, there was no constraining. Everybody, actually the developed world, pumped as much fossil fuels in the carbon dioxide and carbon emissions into the atmosphere with no regard. Now, global warming was also only came into in a discourse in the 1980s. So it was only then that was realized that the carbon emissions were going to cause a massive problem. So that's when people began to pay attention. So the rich world got rich by the massive pollution. And today, they are telling the whole world, and it is of course correct, that all of us have to constrain our emissions. But this is why the Paris Agreement has said that there is a common but differentiated responsibility, that you can't put the developed and the developing country on the same platform. Those who are rich, those who are polluted, and those who have become, industrialized countries, they have the greatest responsibility and a greater responsibility to cut the emissions far more dramatically than the developing world. That's why we cannot have this on the same platform.
Meena,
So
can sorry, if I can interject. Yeah. The question, I guess, when you look at the kind of demands made by progressive groups, as you call them, what impact would that make on the economy? And is, say, for instance, the American economy well-resourced or prepared for the economic impact of such a reduction in emissions?
Well, I think, Sharaad, the point here is that the U.S. actually is a very unequal society. In fact, in terms of emissions around, the richest are the ones who are consuming and polluting most of all in terms of their lifestyle consumption. So you can afford to cut down on your consumption. You can't be going around, consuming as if the world is of no limit. And I think this is where we need to start. It is a transformation. It should have happened in 1990. You remember 1992, the Rio Summit. Already then, everybody knew that the planet cannot continue to in terms of the consumption patterns and the production systems. That transformation ought to have happened already then. But we are delaying action. And the lifestyle of the Americans, as George Bush Sr. said then, was not up for negotiation. Now, that cannot be. You have to negotiate. So there is a stark contrast between the rich of the U.S. and the poor of the U.S., same in other parts of the world. In fact, the 10% of the richest people in the world are consuming 50% are responsible for 50% of the emissions.
Okay.
And the 50% of the world's poor are only responsible for 10%. So you see this stark inequity, and that has to change, both in the global north and global south, and also in the at the national level in terms of the inequities of who is really responsible for the problem.
Meena, just to build on that point, and I wanted to reference an article that you recently wrote about net zero pledges made by rich countries for 2050, and you argue that, again, as you said, it's not going to be enough. But I wanted to ask you about something you said about rather than net zero pledges, it should be a real zero emissions. And then you also talked a little bit about, if I'm not mistaken, you talked about carbon colonialism and how, again, referring to what you've just mentioned. Could you briefly explain what you mean by real zero emissions? Yeah.
So when I talk about the carbon space, we're talking about what we have is 480 gigatons of space left. And we are emitting world over 42 gigatons every year. So in 12 years, we would have exhausted that at current emission levels. So we need to bring this rapidly down. Now, the rich world cannot continue to emit. In fact, if you look at the net zero pledges, net zero basically means if I emit 1 ton of carbon in the atmosphere, I will plant 1 tree and expect that tree to suck that carbon, so I become zero. So +1 -1, I attain 0. But this is actually a fallacy, because you cannot have net zero by 2020 for all countries. The rich world cannot do this because the atmospheric space that is left cannot tolerate that anymore. So actually, they should have gone 0 by now. In fact, the U.S. groups are talking about 195% reduction. This is like negative emissions. So you actually have to bring down emissions even below 100. So real zero actually means no excuse to do net anymore. You have to bring the dramatic, you have to decarbonize. Now you have to go to zero dramatically, and then you will also have to increase your things, of course. But what the developed countries are trying to do is they expect us in the developing world to do all this, keeping our forests and our grasslands and our wetlands and planting more trees so that we can suck up all that emissions that they are going to put into the atmosphere. Now, if you count the net zero pledges and the amount of carbon sinks we need to create, you need another few planets, and we don't have that kind of planet.
Meena, I understand that the U.S. government is also planning to reconvene that Obama-era Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate that focuses on really those countries, those rich countries that contribute the bulk of emissions. Do you welcome that? Do you see that as just a gesture, something symbolic, rather than having perhaps a material and practical effect on the situation with regard to climate change?
Well, actually, they call it the Major Economies Forum, but it initially began, they called it the major emitters. And it's not just the rich countries. They're including China and India in that calculus, actually. And if you look at the Chinese emissions and you look at the Indian emissions, it is large. It's because of their population levels. So if you take a per capita time, the U.S. is much higher. The U.S. per capita is a few times higher than that of China and that of India. India is really much lower. So they are trying to bring all what they call the major emitters together to on a platform to do technology, to talk about how to do the dramatic emissions. But I do think that at the end of the day, if you really talk about the common but differentiated responsibility, they have to provide the financial resources. And this is what we've been calling. If you want the developing countries to go the low carbon pathway, particularly now that we are just recovering from our COVID experience, a lot of our economies are struggling. And if you look at the kind of money that many of the developing countries need to put on the table to actually sustain their health system, it's staggering. They can't even keep their hospitals together. Let alone money for what we call it, climate change. So Meena, we need the financial transfer, we need the technology transfer.
So we understand that this virtual summit in the US is not part of the the UN global process for climate change, right? That's likely to happen in November for COP26. Can you tell us what to expect? Is there going to be the same sense of urgency to hold large emitters accountable?
Well, at the moment, the big question is whether there will be a face-to-face negotiations or a virtual negotiation. That itself is a very big problem for developing countries, because if it's a virtual negotiation, many of our developing countries are suffering from the digital divide. They don't have access to the same kind of internet connections. So you can't even negotiate properly in a virtual setting. So COP26 is important, but it's not as if the countries only gather in Glasgow to make their ambitious pledges. They are supposed to make their ambitious pledges even now. So there's no excuse for the rich countries to actually do much better on their ambition. But we are very, it's quite disappointing to see the kind of announcements coming on because of this whole fanciful net zero and the carbon offset they're talking about and the carbon markets that they are talking about. So you go back to the same old conventional delaying tactic of climate inaction. And so we're really worried that this net zero is not going to save the world. It's going to take us to actually a wrong direction of a further catastrophe. So we have to unpack the numbers and we have to see the details for what they are. Right. But the rich world has no excuse and they cannot continue to pursue.
Meena, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
We're going to take a quick break, but after this, we will come back and take a look at a local perspective. What is Malaysia's commitment to the fight against climate change? Stay tuned.
Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada Islam. Orang yang membuat polisi
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face masks, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. Awani 745 lebih awal dari biasa.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program.
Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope. Thank you so much for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our exploration of Earth Day's call to restore the planet through emerging technologies and innovative thinking. How do we make this global call local? And who's listening? Joining us on the line now, we have Faizal Parish, Director of the NGO Global Environment Centre. Good evening, Faizal. Thank you for joining us on the show tonight. Now, the Global Environment Centre put out an Earth Day statement in which it noted that Malaysia has to, if I may quote, give up the conventional development trajectory of the grow first, clean up later mantra. Now, instead, we embrace, and you're calling for us to embrace sustainability as a core principle in development. I'm wondering, Faizal, who are the stakeholders that are hindering this paradigm shift at the moment?
Unfortunately, many of us, we're also guilty of this as the public, the community, but also if we want to move forward in the proper way, a sustainable way, we need the stakeholders to work together. That's the public, business sector, government must move in a harmonized way together and build a proper vision of how to work forward. Many other countries have been successful in this. For example, on climate change, many countries have decoupled their development from climate greenhouse gas emissions. So they're able to develop in a proper way without continually increasing their emissions from energy use and otherwise. Other countries have introduced circular economy, where they've been really every product developed has its own recycle or reuse cycle or approach. And we need to do this in Malaysia, but each stakeholder alone can't do this alone. So we need to work together and come with that integrated way of working.
Faizal, many critics of the more progressive end of the environmental movement will say that the demands that they're making are far too idealistic. They will, in fact, stunt growth, reduce jobs, and they're politically untenable for governments in democratic settings to implement or sell to the public. What would your response be to those kind of criticisms?
I mean, basically, generally they have their facts wrong. Of course, if you totally shut down everything, all activity on the planet, you're going to impact people. But it's been shown time and time again by bringing green jobs, by bringing renewable energy, by bringing more people-centric approach, by engaging the local community in acting as stewards of the land, we can create much more jobs, much more wealth, particularly in the hands of the rural poor. Here in Malaysia, many of the poor are in the rural areas, and they've been marginalized, and they have not the income generation possibility, and other elites are taking the natural resources. If we empower those communities, if we have a more better spread of how the resource is accessed and managed, actually we can create more jobs, more income for many of the communities without impacting the overall economy. That can still move forward, but we need to look at a more equitable arrangement where people are able to get access, and it's not just a certain elite who are getting all of the wealth from natural resources and development. So we need a more balanced approach.
No, I hear you, Faizal. I mean, it seems that, civil society, environmentalists, activists, they seem to be unanimous as to what must be done. But as you pointed out, it's elites, it's government, it's business interests who seem to hold all the cards. I'm wondering what civic action can do. Can civic action and civil society bring balance to this power equation as that underscores the politics of climate change?
I mean, we have seen mass movements throughout the world have brought the people together, shown the voice of the people, and have made a difference. But how quickly that can change the political situation or the business view, it needs working together. Of course, one could say at the ballot box, the people can vote for the parties that will have that balanced approach. But in countries like ours, that takes a long time to look at that for those changes to take place. So we need to find a way to short-circuit that and to bring that voice, common voice. And I think that's what the effort at the global level, bringing all the countries together, like this week's climate summit, bringing countries together, giving key vision. But I think we need that government to take action. Private sector is also able to take action. We've seen massive changes by the investors. The pension funds of the world are now shifting their investment. They're getting out of coal and oil and fossil fuels and putting the money into renewables. All of us, with all of our investment, we need EPF and others to invest our money into more sustainable sources. But that also can rapidly change the trajectory. And I think it's possible. I mean, US has just set this target by 2030 of a 50 to 52% reduction compared to 2005. Malaysia, we have a target of 45% by 2030, but that's more from business as usual trajectory, not absolute reduction. But we need to increase the ambition of that, and we need to work together. But people can take their own action. We can all reduce our energy footprint and other things. We've learned a lot during COVID that we don't have to be driving everywhere all the time. We can work online a lot. That can make some reduction. But if the government is still facilitating new fossil fuel power stations, is allowing the destruction and clearing of our forests, then we're wasting our time as a community. We have to get that bad behavior to stop, bring that in line with the government commitment to reduce emissions, and then all work together, business, government and community.
Faizal, the last time we had you on the show, we were talking about the Kuala Langar, the North Forest, the Forest Reserve, and that issue, seems to be emblematic of the lack of political will, supposedly a progressive government, but now it seems colluding with developers and, broadly speaking, the 1%. In order to destroy an invaluable resource and a carbon sink, if you like to put it in practical terms. What is ultimately the question of environment and climate change and tackling climate change a political one? Do you think that's the best way to understand this?
It's true. It's a very, it needs political action and political will. And sometimes the politician is only looking at the short-term gain. But actually, if they really change the direction and give a bold new vision, as we can see from the new government in America, then you can bring along the people behind that vision. And I think there are always people who are against that and say you're going to lose jobs and so on. But I think, as I mentioned, if we have the right vision, working together, everyone can benefit, and the voters, the rakyat, can benefit from that. Right. And what we've seen too many times is that there is elite capture, and the elite are driving the process. And we need to change that, because we're already being impacted severely by climate change. We're seeing more floods, we're seeing more storms, we're seeing the sea level rise, eroding our coast, salinizing our groundwater, we're seeing more fires and haze, and that is going to get 10 times worse in the coming years if we don't take action. And that really needs to galvanize political and other action to make a difference. For Kuala Langat North, yes, a very small area of less than 1,000 hectares. It's a massive carbon store with more than 6 million tons of carbon dioxide. If you destroy that, you're setting the whole process and the Malaysian target of emission reduction backwards. The same with many other developments on peatlands. The federal government has taken a stand. No more development on peatlands, but the state governments, unfortunately, are not listening to that policy direction. Right. We do need to get everyone in the right direction, and realizing if we don't do it, the people are going to suffer. If the people suffer, I think the politicians are going to suffer after that.
Well, Faizal, you've painted a very bleak picture, and I'm just wondering, have there been any success stories on the local environmental front, or is it an irredeemably grim picture?
Unfortunately, many of the indicators are trending downwards. Deforestation, climate, water resources, land degradation, biodiversity loss. There have been some progress, some positive stories. For example, Malaysia has made a big effort for mangrove protection and rehabilitation in many areas through a national program. We learned the lesson from the tsunami that mangroves are important for protecting the coast, and the government have made an effort together with the community. At the ASEAN level, we've made a big progress on addressing transboundary haze and peatland degradation. The fires in peatlands caused that. We do have problems in Malaysia, but there have been investments and efforts to reduce that. And for example, in Selangor, there's been a 95% reduction in the amount of peatland fires as a result of partnership between government and local communities in peatland areas to re-wet and to restore peatlands and to reduce the chance of fire. And that is now being spread to other states in Peninsular Malaysia and elsewhere. So there are positive news, and those initiatives, mangrove and peatland, are making a major impact on reducing our greenhouse gas or climate footprint. That just needs to be scaled up, but the business as usual, large-scale development also needs to be changed and redirected so that it's more people-friendly, more environment-friendly, and that will be a win-win situation that can lead to longer-term economic prosperity.
All right. Faizal, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. But before we leave you tonight, a quick reminder, don't forget to get all the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com and the Astro AWANI app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
We will be back with you same time tomorrow. Till then,
good night.